for a long time. And in fact, I've known Ross for a long time because we often end up at the same conferences on this topic together. I think, as you've seen from Ross's talk, the content is rather different from what a lot of people have talked about during this sort of 6-month program, but it's related to the talk when I'm going to talk about discrimination, so it's related to what Cynthia spoke about earlier. Unfortunately, I had to speak at I missed Cynthia's talk because I had to speak at a meeting to honour Sir David Cox's receipt of the inaugural International Prize in Statistics, so I couldn't get to Cynthia's talk. So I've worked in this area for about 30 years, but as Ross noted, as an academic, so working in sort of consultancy role or expert witness role in court cases and so on. Working on retail banking data, so credit card, consumer loans, mortgages, car finance, that sort of thing. Those sort of problems involve millions of customers, billions of transactions, so it's big data, before the term big data was ever invented. So there are problems, issues of data set sizes, there are issues of streaming data. The data sort of keep on coming. If you're concerned with fraud detection, an area I've done a lot of work in as well, you can't stop the system, take the transactions away, analyse them, 3 months later come back, even if your system is perfectly accurate, and say, yeah, I can tell you when you're perfectly accurately whether the transactions are fraudulent. You need to know now, you need to be able to state it now on the fly as the transactions are made so that you can stop them before they're completed. But these sorts of data also have pressing confidentiality and privacy issues. So for some of the projects I worked on with my PhD students, the data would be on hard drives separate from the computer, which would be locked away overnight, and they would be analysed on computers which didn't have Wi-Fi, weren't connected to the internet, and so on. So highly confidential. The records themselves would have been anonymised. I have to say that once a credit organisation sent me non-anonymised records. Kind of horrifying seeing all these names and addresses. But you have to be a bit careful, and for the reasons that you know well and have been discussing over this program. I have a little example of failure to anonymise, or how careful you have to be. One of my projects involved analysing ATM withdrawals. So we had map of the ATMs locations all over the country, and we could tell where people had made withdrawals, and using that we were able to work out basically who individuals were, because you can see that mostly they made withdrawals clearly near where they worked in London, and sometimes near where they lived in their village, and you can go on and link it with other data to identify people, so you obviously have to be careful. So much of my work's been concerned with modelling consumer behaviour. Oops, what's happening here? Plug in or find another power source. Your battery is low, 6%. Aha! Oh, we're not. There is no. There's a socket. So I'm concerned with. Did you sort it out? Is it? Yeah, great, thanks. Well, that's one way of. Nope, we're okay. This is okay, but not. All right. Fortunately, I haven't got to the slides yet. So, yeah. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks. Okay, so as Ross explained, basically what we do is build statistical models to predict behaviour, be it fraud or credit risk or whatever. The issue is the issue that I want to talk about is that these credit models are subject to particular kinds of constraints, which I'm going to illustrate, arising from equality and anti-discrimination legislation. In particular, you are not allowed to apply different rules, different treatments to certain groups, males versus females, for example. This had, in a way, always struck me. I can understand the social force behind this, but it also had struck me as a little odd, because I would have thought that one might be interested in estimating the best finding the best estimates of probability of default, for instance, that you can, and basing your decisions on that. I'm going to illustrate these things in a moment. But I was a little puzzled by it, but I didn't dwell on it since that was the way it was. And then something happened on the 1st of March 2011, which motivated me to look at it more closely, and I'm going to tell you about that. So this is really what anonymisation, this is a sort of caricature of anonymisation. Anonymisation says, I don't know who you are, but I know this about you. I know characteristics of you. That's anonymisation. Anti-discrimination says, I know who you are, but I don't know this about you. It's a sort of complement, if you like. These are caricatures, but they sort of illustrate why I'm giving this talk in a sense. In anonymisation, the aim is to allow the wider use of personal data, in some contexts anyway, and the method, sort of, is to strip away information, strip away identifiers, if you like. Anti-discrimination legislation, the aim is to avoid using certain kinds of personal information, gender, for instance, when making decisions about individuals, and you do that by stripping away information again. So similar sorts of things. They're not the same, but they are in some sense sort of complementary. Anonymisation aims to treat individuals as members of groups. I don't know who you are, but I know that you are one of these sorts of people, so I can't make statements about you as an individual. But an anti-discrimination aims to treat individuals and not as members of groups. It doesn't want to make a statement about you because you are male or a certain age or whatever. It's supposed to regard you as unique, not simply as one of many men, for instance. So again, these things are sort of complementary. Obviously, in both situations, both cases, the aim is to sort of compromise. It's a question of balancing good against harm. And that's not, that's generally true, and it's generally recognised. The quote here, the right to data protection is not an absolute right, but must be considered in relation to its function in society. So this is from the EU Court of Justice. This is sort of recognised even by lawyers. But as you all know, with a statistical sort of background, you can never reduce risk to zero without reducing value to zero, and that's particularly true, obviously, in the case of anonymisation and so on. Clearly true for data linkage and on anonymisation. It's also true for financial services. And so here's a little personal example. You want your bank account to be secure so that people can't break into it easily. So you have passwords and various ways of accessing it. How elaborate do you want that procedure to be? So again, it's this sort of compromise against risk and value, between risk and value. And obviously there's no ideal solution. Different sort of criteria might conflict. There are all sorts of, this has become a sort of hot topic. There are all sorts of ethical considerations involved. I have a couple of examples of the sorts of developments that are going on there. NSDEC is the National Statisticians Data Ethics Advisory Committee in the UK, which was set up earlier this year to inform the national statistician about ethical issues to do with linkage, anonymisation, and many other sorts of things. DGWG is the Data Governance Working Group, a Royal Society British Academy joint working group, which is going to report to government early next year on issues of data governance, privacy, confidentiality, these sorts of things. But things are complicated by the fact that we don't live in a stationary world. It's constantly changing. A governance structure that was suitable is changing especially fast at the moment, of course, which is why the DGWG was set up. Something which was perfectly fine 10 years ago because of the progress and development of the web and things like that may not be so now, and perhaps more important, is not going to be appropriate in 10 years' time. And also something which crops up occasionally in these sorts of discussions is that social attitudes change, and it's difficult to tell what they're going to be like in the future. Maybe we're seeing a backlash against sort of people freely divulging information to corporations and so on. Maybe we're not, I don't know. So obviously well-constructed regulation and governance are needed to try to strike a suitable compromise here. And then this is at two levels, at a societal level and at an individual level. And I have sort of examples here. At a societal level, we want to try to constrain the vulnerabilities of safety critical systems, clearly. From deliberate attacks, we want to keep the data safe from people trying to steal it. From loss, we want to keep the data safe. Yeah, the truth is, every week in the UK at least, you seem to read an article about someone who's lost a CD of data or something like that, accidentally lost data. And of course also to preserve the balance, talking about the balance, preserving democratic values. And we can also think of nations where they, in some sense, know too much about the individuals and behave badly. But at a personal level, similar sorts of things apply. We want to avoid unfair discrimination with this sort of implications of restrictions of opportunities. And we also want to avoid reputational damage or embarrassment. And I have a couple of quotes to illustrate that. This is one, a defining characteristics of the British whose aim in life has been described as being to get to the end of life without too much embarrassment, so we can wipe our brow and say, made it. That's avoiding reputational damage and embarrassment. And here's a quote from Terry Pratchett, talking about the innocent having nothing to fear, and I'm talking about reputational damage and democratic values and so on. I'll let you read that one. So that's a sort of background, sort of meander really. I'm interested in credit, so first I'm going to say a little bit about credit in general and then retail credit. So credit is one of the drivers of capitalist organisations. It's essential, an essential lubricant for economic affairs. Without credit, our society wouldn't function. It has a number of characteristics: smooths out costs, accelerates economic developments, and it happens at all levels, from microloans to giant multinationals. And here's a couple of, again, another couple of quotes from Niall Ferguson, the historian who's written this book, The Ascent of Money, which you might have read, saying first that credit has been a critical driver to economic development, and also saying something about at a more personal level as well. So I'm interested in retail credit scoring that Ross talked about, the credit given to individuals, not to corporations. So you will have credit lines, you'll have credit cards or mortgages or whatever. The fundamental objective that I've been concerned with is constructing a statistical model, a credit score if you like, for predicting behaviour. And the behaviour, Ross listed a few behaviours you might be interested in predicting. There are some illustrated there as well. And the sort of characteristics you will build, the predictive characteristics, the predictors you'll use to build these models are demographic characteristics. They might be income, number of dependents, various things, and also behavior on other financial products. And you'll put these all together into a giant statistical model. Ross referred to this. He mentioned a case in Germany which had used social network data, I think you said. I've come across a couple of startups which are also building, trying to take into account Facebook or other sort of interactions to feed into credit scoring models. And of course, when you talk to these startups or they try to get you to fund them or whatever, apparently they're very, very successful at using Facebook data to predict how well people do in credit. I have my reservations. The statistical models should be contrasted with the human, what preceded them, human judgmental approaches where the bank manager would just make a decision. The advantages of the computational models are various. They're tireless, they don't get exhausted, they're consistent. You give them the same data, they'll make the same conclusion. They're objective. You've actually got an algorithm recipe written down. What I think is most important, though, is incremental improvement. You've got a model, you can experiment with adding new predictors to it or varying it in other ways, and if it improves things, keep it, and gradually, tiny step at a time, you can build up to something which is really powerful. And nowadays these models are really powerful. They're very, very accurate. They're very good models. They can't be 100% accurate because in between giving someone credit and a couple of years down the line, by which time they should have repaid, something could have happened. They might have fallen ill or lost their jobs or something. So there's inevitably stochasticity in this. Nevertheless, these models are very good. And what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is I'm going to take loans and gender as a working example, but it applies more generally, as I've tried to illustrate. So here's the UK Equality Act. This has a definition of direct discrimination. A person A discriminates against another B if, because of a protected characteristic, which I'm going to come to in a moment, A treats B less favourably than A treats or would treat others. So what it's saying is you mustn't treat someone less favourably than others because they fall into a particular group, where a group is defined by these protected characteristics. It's not rather than treating them less favourably on the basis of their own merits. It's the group sort of classification. Sometimes in this act you find this phrase, if A cannot show it to be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. It doesn't refer to all of the protected characteristics, but some of them. I'm going to come back to that. These are the UK protected characteristics. This is the order in which they appear in the Act, which always seems to me to be rather odd, but I'm not going to read them all out. You can read them for yourselves. There are other things that you might have thought might be legitimate, reasonable to include as protected characteristics. Anyway, this is... Yeah, please. I may not be able to answer.
A 30-year loan to someone who's 80 years old?
You're not allowed to, yeah, I mean, that's right, you can't take that into account. Just, legally you're not allowed to, but let me go on because, that's really the point.
Also, presumably this completely outlines positive discrimination as well.
I beg your pardon?
This also means that you can't do positive discrimination.
Yeah, you can't treat someone, if you've got two groups, if you can't treat this group less favourably, you can't treat this group more favourably, absolutely.
Try to have more women in your organisation.
Yes, yeah. That seems to be what the law's saying. Yeah, absolutely. So the aim is to treat the groups fairly or equally or not less favourably, and as you say, not by implication, not more favourably. That's really the aim. But what I want to look at is what exactly this means and the implications. What time have I got to finish? Because 11. I think it's actually 1:45, but I was hoping he'd say 11. I'm hoping I can go on for just a few minutes after 1:45. That's really what I'm hoping.
Ask too many questions.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I just give you some examples of data which have collected describing what's going on. So this is an example looking at ethnic differences in mortgage application denials, and they found there were ethnic differences, and so they controlled for various things like financial employment and neighbourhood characteristics, but they still found that certain ethnic groups in this area of the study are roughly 60% more likely to be turned down than whites. So something's going on. This didn't seem to conform to the law. Here's another example. The Equality and Human Rights Commission study on gender pay differences in the financial services sector found that on average women earn as much as 55% less than men, meaning people in particular groups defined by protected characteristics were being treated less favourably. But they also noted that women were different in other ways. They're disproportionately unemployed in lower skilled jobs, for instance. So perhaps the less favourable treatment arises from the lower skilled roles. Again, so expand that. Here's another, and I think my final example. There are obviously others. Gender differences in credit scores. These are the scores which determine whether you will be given a loan or whatever it is. The average credit score for men in the data they looked at was higher than that for women. And this was true for all ages, throughout all ages. So again, particular groups are treated less favourably, but again, men and women differed in various ways. On average, the men had larger debt, so maybe that might, if these things were feeding into the credit score, maybe that would explain why the credit scores were different. But things get quite complicated here, because maybe they had larger debt because they had a higher credit score, so they could more easily get more debt and so on. So there are complex causal relationships here. But really what I wanted to put that up was to show you that the average scores were different. The groups seem to be treated differently in some ways. Oh, this is just a plot of age versus credit scores for men red, women blue. I wonder why. This is taken from a paper. I just wondered why they'd coloured it that way around. That's interesting. Okay,
You're not allowing for couples there, because that would make a huge difference.
I think so. I think there are other issues as
Single
well.
men,
Yeah.
single women, it might be very different.
I've been talking about credit, and now I want to switch to insurance. You'll see why in a moment. The EU Gender Directive sought to counter discrimination based on gender in this way, in the same way as before, but it included an opt-out clause, which is related to something I said a moment ago. It permitted proportionate differences in individuals' premiums and benefits where the use of sex is a determining factor in the assessment of risk based on relevant and accurate actuarial and statistical data. If it actually calculated the probabilities, and if it found that men were more risky than women, you could take that into account. So that there was this opt-out to the general, you must not treat groups differently. But then, in 2008, a lawsuit was filed in Belgium claiming that this opt-out was incompatible with the equal treatment. And here's the date I referred to, 1st March 2011. The European Court of Justice concluded that that opt-out was invalid. It was illegal, if you like. So, here was the situation beforehand, and I'm taking motor insurance as an example just to drive this through. Females had lower premiums at all levels except 70 and over because females are basically safer drivers. But those difference, and that was allowed because of that opt-out, looking at the data. But that would no longer be, the differences would no longer be allowed, even though the data showed that younger females were less risky than younger males. So let's look at before I look at the implications of that, this is not the only case. Here's another little case from quite a long way back where female employees, 5 minutes, thank you very much, female employees successfully sued Los Angeles Department of Water and Power because they had to pay larger pension contributions and so on. The judge's statement was interesting, basically pointing out that practices that classify employees in terms of groups tend to preserve additional assumptions rather than the thoughtful scrutiny of individuals. Treating them as groups rather than individuals is to be avoided. So back to my motor insurance example. The continuous curves show black male, red female premiums. This is age on the horizontal axis. And you can see that before the legislation, before the EU legislation said this opt-out clause was illegal, the males had paid higher premiums. The actuarial, the statistical analysis said they were more risky, so they paid more premiums. The broken line shows you what happens after. So the males were higher. Broken line shows you what happens after the legislation where this opt-out was declared illegal, and you can see that males, they come closer together. And in fact, these are the changes. The red is the post minus pre change for the females, and you can see that at the younger age, especially, suddenly females are having to pay much more than they did before, and males are having to pay less. This is what you'd expect. Previously, the actual probabilities were taken into account. Now, suddenly, the premiums have got to be the same. And these are the averages. So, men, women, before and after. And you can see that the men, their premiums reduced, but were reduced by the legislation, and women were increased. So let's look at the implications of this. One consequence is there are more men on the road now, more of these younger men on the road, because they can more easily afford the premiums. Okay, so they're more able to drive. But younger men are more risky, which means now that we've got more of the riskier drivers on the road. In contrast, fewer women, their premiums have gone up. Fewer women can afford the premiums and will be on the road, which means, of course, we've got fewer of the safer drivers on the road. Now, I want to ask you, is that good for society? Is it fair or equal treatment? I'm going to have to go on for another 5 minutes because I haven't got to the statistics yet. The fundamental problem is that there are different ways of defining fair or equal or less favourably and so on, and they're mutually incompatible. If you adopt one definition, the other one is necessarily contravened. The trouble is that, what I've written here, law, unlike maths, isn't a self-consistent system of axioms. If it was, we wouldn't need so many lawyers. Okay, I want to describe what's going on here sort of mathematically and what I think should be done. And I'm going to take a very simple scenario. I'm going to have one permitted characteristic that you're allowed to use in the scorecard and one protected characteristic, something you're not allowed to use. And they're both going to be binary, just 2 groups each. And I've got a response which you can think of as proportion defaulting. And I'm going to assume that I don't have to estimate the probabilities, I know them or whatever. And people with the same score are going to be treated in the same way. So here's case 1, model 1. We might use both the permitted and the protected characteristics in a linear model, for instance. And there's my model with the 2 characteristics u and v, and I'm going to produce my score from that model. So here, what I've done is I calculated the best estimate of the probability of defaulting that I can using all the information that I've got, and then default that my score is just my estimate of the default probability. Trouble is, this could mean that 2 people differing only on the protected variable have different scores. If only v is different, they could have a different value of y. And so they'd be treated differently, which would contravene the act. So we don't want to do this. Here's another approach. This is really what most of the industry does. It says, I'm not allowed to use the protected characteristic, so I won't. I shall ignore it. I shall pretend I never collected it. So I've only got the permitted characteristic u, and I've built a model, and I'm going to use that to predict my score. My score is y, just based on u. So here now, equal means that people with the same vector of permitted characteristics have the same score. There are issues here. The permitted characteristics might be, and indeed usually will be, correlated with protected variables. And indeed, if you want to think that through, just imagine to yourself what would happen if they were perfectly correlated. So because of this correlation, the protected variables might be creeping back in, again, contravening the act. In fact, what often happens in the industry is you can go further and say, well, I can see that this variable is correlated with this one, so I'm not going to use it as a proxy for this protected variable. I'm going to cut that out as well. But following that too far, you could remove all the variables, and you can certainly, by doing that, you're certainly removing any additional predictive power that the other variables, which are just correlated with the protected variables, might have. And in fact, I won't go through this in detail. There are examples of that from real data, showing that you shouldn't just drop variables which are correlated with the protected variables, because you're losing predictive information. So 2 more cases. We could use both the permitted and the protected variables in a linear model to predict probability of default, in a model to predict probability of default, but then score using just the partial model, ignoring the protected characteristic. Now here, equal treatment would mean that people with the same vector of protected characteristics would have the same score. So this is, if you like, the classical regression coefficient interpretation. It's not a very good interpretation, but it's an approximation. It's the effect of a permitted variable keeping the protected variable constant. But of course, this uses the protected variables in calculating the model, and the coefficient beta will depend on having these protected variables in the model. So in some sense, you're still also using the protected variables and hence contravening the act. Finally, another alternative might be to fit different models for each cell of the cross-classification of protected variables. In my case, with just a binary, I've only got 2 cells, just build separate models. And then in your, for instance, decisions about whether to give people loans or not, you could say, well, I'm going to give 80% in each group loans. So now you're treating the 2 groups equally. But necessarily involves using the protected variables, because right at the start I said I'm going to build separate models for the 2 groups. So contravening the act again. Got here. You'll be relieved. The trouble is that the different notions of fair or equal treatment or less favourably or whatever are fundamentally incompatible. The common industry approach of simply dropping the protected variables is pretty appalling, doesn't work, and seems to contravene the act anyway. It's certainly not satisfactory. I think ideally we'd include the protected characteristics and use the best possible estimate of the default probability as the score. But recognising the social imperatives, I think the last 2 models I came up with are the appropriate sorts of things. the partial regression score, where you build a model using all your information, but then you make decisions just using the permitted characteristics, or use entirely separate models and then treat the two groups in equivalent ways. For instance, accepting 80% in each of the two groups. But as I say, the industry standard doesn't do that. But these two models, in any case, have to, at some level, take cognizance of the values of the protected variables. And there we have it. Thank you.
We have time for one quick question.
So, if I understand, what you propose is a manual procedure in the final slide, whereby you compare what is obtained using the protected attributes and without using them.
Do you mean this one?
Yeah, this. Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm trying to do there is build a model which uses all the information in the permitted characteristics, which is orthogonal to the protected characteristics. The trouble with the second model, the trouble with the model which just throws away the protected characteristics and anything correlated with that, is that it can also throw away other things, which are other information which is perfectly legitimate, which you would like to include. So you don't want to throw away the protected characteristics and anything correlated with them. You just want to throw away part of the variables which are correlated with them, and that's what the regression approach, which builds a model on all of the data and then focuses on the bits which are not the protected characteristic, does. And I personally think that's the most elegant approach. Anyway, this other approach, I think, has merit as well, but I think that would be much harder to convince people about, that it, with satisfaction.
I think people want to have a coffee, so you're up, David, so please talk to David over the coffee break or lunchtime. So we